Good evening, folks. My name is Charles Madden, but known around the inner city of Sydney as Chicka. Now, that's a nickname that I got many, many years ago going to Redfern Public School, which is now NCIE, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence. Folks, I'm from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. That's the land we're on at the moment. For many, many years, I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I've been involved with many different Aboriginal organisations over the years. I've been a director with the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern for over 40 years. Also a director with the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Company, Aboriginal Hostels Australia, and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, where I am still a very active member. Folks, I've got to mention it. Also a life member of the Redfern All Blacks Rugby League Football Club. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I'd like to take this opportunity this afternoon to extend a warm and sincere welcome to any of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We have any brothers and sisters here from the Torres Strait or further afar across the seas. Welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. The Gadigal clan is one of 29 that makes up the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bordered by 3 distinctive landmarks. We have the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Peen to the west, and the Georges River to the south. Those 3 rivers form the boundaries of the Eora Nation. Folks, if you've travelled across this great city of ours today, the state or this great country, or from afar, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. Enjoy your stay. Have a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Enjoy the evening, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful welcome to country. So tonight, of course, we meet on Gadigal country and also on the site of Australia's first government house, built in May 1788, and evidenced, of course, by the archaeological remains of the foundations underfoot that you cross tonight to get to the museum. This was the place of the seat of British authority for the first 50 years of British settlement and home, of course, to the colony's first 9 governors. Since the museum opened in 1995, we have recognised that this site is one of the most potent and provocative symbols of British colonisation of Australia. This symbolism means different things, of course, to different people and can be a powerful frame to explore perspectives on history and how we see ourselves as Australians today. It was here in this place, on this very place, that official government attitudes, actions and decisions were cemented and enforced that had and continue to have significant impact on the lives of Aboriginal Australians. Now, last Sunday morning, I had, in my madness, decided to do a half marathon, and I stood nervous because I hadn't quite done enough training, but as always, have more ambition than talent. And I looked up, it was dawn, it was about 6:30, and it was in front of St Mary's, and I looked up, feeling nervous, and I saw the flags that were flying for Reconciliation Week. I had in the back of my mind that if I got through this, I could get to Friday night and tonight's important event. And of course, what the phrase was on those banners was, let's take the next steps. There was a kind of power of purpose and I think of hope in that message. It took my mind away from that terrible 21 kilometres I was about to run and to really focus on the greater context and concern, I think, and need for progress. And I know that we've made those small steps here at this institution. We've begun the process of taking those next steps within our own institution at Sydney Living Museums. We have developed over the past 2 years an Aboriginal action plan, It's under Mark Goggin, who joined us about 3-4 years ago, who's really helped us champion that as Chief Executive. And we've established an Aboriginal Advisory Committee. And I acknowledge here today our Chair, Michael McDaniel, and Robynne Quiggin, who, from our committee, and Peter White, who's been providing strategic advisory role with us and really helping us craft this Aboriginal Sydney Speaks program. And tonight is the first event of that program that we hope will go for several years. And I'd particularly like to thank our wonderful panellists, Gail Mabo, Bruce Pascoe, Sam Wagan Watson, of course, as well as Michael McDaniel and Robynne Quiggin. I also would like to acknowledge Professor Grace Karskens, who served on our board for 9 years, only recently departed, and Siobhan Tuhu and Rod Simpson, also on our board and big supporters of the work that we do. And our partner, Murrumbidgee, Peter Chia, who runs Murrumbidgee, who's here tonight too, who's working with us on a fantastic project at Rouse Hill, and also Tanya Koneman, who sits on our Heritage Advisory Committee. We thank you all for helping us work through our Aboriginal Action Plan and take those next steps. I also thank our partner on tonight's program, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, and the wonderful Marcus Hughes, who really helped us craft tonight. Thank you, Marcus. And Tristan Sharp and the other members of staff from MAS. We recognise that our Sydney Living Museums and heritage sites exist within culturally significant Aboriginal landscapes. We acknowledge the diverse ongoing cultural values and heritage that the Aboriginal communities of the Sydney region have within their country. Understanding this profound connection with country, we commit ourselves to achieving genuine engagement with and representation of Aboriginal communities in our institutions' outcomes for today and tomorrow. We aim to increase Aboriginal participation across all aspects of SLM's work and foster healthy relationships between our staff, museums, heritage sites, collections, and the appropriate Aboriginal communities to accurately showcase this living cultural landscape. So tonight's In Conversation explores the far-reaching impact of an official action, Governor Bourke's proclamation of 1835. This unassuming piece of paper, now held in the National Archives, UK, is far from a dusty piece of our past, consigned to history books, but rather part of a complex political landscape still lived today. I think this promises to be a powerful, lively, and perhaps for some an uncomfortable conversation, but a critical step towards a better understanding of our true past so that we can better embrace a shared national future. And I'd like to welcome particularly Robynne Quiggin, who's our facilitator for tonight. Robynne is the former Deputy Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. She's a Wiradjuri lawyer and has worked across legal and policy areas of relevance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, including human rights, consumer issues, financial services, governance, rights to culture, arts, heritage. Robynne has served on so many boards, including the Arts Law Centre of Australia, the Gadigal Information Services. She's currently Deputy Chair of the Bangarra Dance Theatre, a Trustee of the Australian Museum, Chair of Westpac's Indigenous Advisory Committee, Chair of First Hand Solutions, and a member of the Indigenous Law Bulletin's editorial pattern. Wow. We're thrilled that you're here tonight, Robynne. Thank you so much for facilitating, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction and introduction to the evening. Thank you, Uncle Chicka, for the welcome to your country. And I acknowledge also that we meet on the land of the Gadigal, and again pay my respects to elders past and present. I seem to be losing my voice, which is a bit of a shame, but maybe that'll keep me from saying too much more. It's my job to introduce the rest of the panel and to pose some questions to them. I'd also just like to begin, though, by setting some context and acknowledging also the important role of cultural institutions in having these kinds of conversations, and acknowledge the people that work within them because, you know, as we've heard tonight, this could be a challenging conversation in some ways. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it does take courage to step out and invite people to have to hear our views, to hear what can be a really different way of thinking. And I also, you know, note that beginning with the proclamation, and thank you for the great reading, is really kind of bringing to the fore, you know, a document that I didn't know about. That and to me, the big message from that is that we have the ownership and the way that we live in this country is contested. Contested even amongst from the early days, it was contested. And I want to note today that we, as part of that contested history, as part of that contested experience of whose place this is and who has authority in this place and how do we treat each other. Today is Sorry Day, where we think about and reflect on and commemorate the policies, the incredibly cruel and inhuman policies of removal, government policies for many, many years, the removal of Aboriginal children and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, from their culture, from their country. What a phenomenally disruptive tool of colonisation to take your children. You cannot pass on language, you cannot pass on culture, you cannot pass on connection, you cannot pass on knowledge when you take people. So today is a day that we pause and after a long fight, you know, I took a long fight with the government after the handing down and the bringing them home report, the first national inquiry that really exposed what was going on and told the story of the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. That report we waited a long time for the apology that was finally given, and to really commemorate this day and the beginning of of Reconciliation Week. Tomorrow is another important day. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the 1967 referendum. The referendum's described in lots of different ways, but really what it did was remove some elements of racist parts of the Constitution, and also gave the Commonwealth the power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that was extremely important because the states were making some pretty gross laws for us. It was the states that made those laws that took the children away. And so the Commonwealth was given power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the 1967 referendum. And we have laws like the one that Gail's father began the litigation for, that resulted in the Native Title Act. We have that law under that head of power that was created really with the referendum, the 1967 referendum. So it's a time of a lot of anniversaries, and importantly as well, today we hear from the people, the delegates at Wiradjuri, who have come up with a plan for a way forward. Now, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's more big discussions about how we come to terms with this seriously contested history, and present day. So I thought I might begin by asking each of the, by stopping talking for one, except for introducing the rest of the panellists to you and asking them to reflect on the proclamation and on, particularly, I guess, on the way that it took authority away from, in a very formal way, from Aboriginal people in relation to the decisions that they were able to make in relation to country. So I will begin with our panellists to my immediate left, and I'll introduce you and then ask you to comment if that's all right, and because otherwise there will be quite a long series of introductions and it'll get a bit dull and I'll just keep on talking. So Professor Michael McDaniel is to my left. Professor Michael McDaniel is an Aboriginal man, a member of the Kalari clan of the Wiradjuri Nation of Central Western New South Wales. Michael is Pro-Vice Chancellor, Indigenous Leadership and Engagement, and Director of Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney, where he is also a Professor in Indigenous Education. Michael is a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies and recently appointed as council member of the Institute and appointed also to its Research Advisory Committee. He's a member of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium and chair of the board of Bangarra. He serves on the board of the Museum of Contemporary Art, chairs the MCA's Indigenous Advisory Group and chair, as was mentioned, of the Sydney Living Museum's Aboriginal Advisory Committee. So I will stop talking now and over to you, Michael, for your reflections.
My reflections. I've got to say that it was, I suppose I've been thinking about the lead up to this and what are my reflections, but it was really powerful to just hear the words. And I think the way that everyone just responded in absolute silence, it was like an axe coming down. And then that had quite a strong emotional impact on me, so I think it probably did other people. But I've been thinking about this, and you know, our history is not the history of New Zealand. And our country is not like New Zealand, as anyone who's been to New Zealand will tell you, and is aware of the Indigenous, non-Indigenous Māori Pākehā relationship there. And the source of the difference in the relationship is the way in which the colonisers chose to deal with the issue of Indigenous rights and relationship to land and resources from the very beginning. And we were just out there talking before, and the imperial process, the colonial process, was a cruel process across the world. There's not a single Indigenous people in the world that are thriving because of the colonial process. All are suffering and all are trying to recover from that in some way or other. The degree to which people suffered, they varied across the globe and within the British Empire. And unfortunately, the British in this country chose to take the cruelest path they had chosen to take in any part of the empire, in the sense that, you know, as we know from the wonderful work of Uncle Quiggin Mabo, before 1992, this country was the only former British colony that took the position that Indigenous people had absolutely no rights to our traditional lands and waters whatsoever. No right flowing from our existence other than the gifts of land that we were given. And to be a people who take that position, you have to take other positions in order to live with that decision. Firstly, you have to dehumanise those people, devalue them to such an incredible degree that you actually think that that is good and right and proper and subject to celebration annually and ongoing, which we still do. And then not care about the impact of that decision on people still. So it's quite debilitating, you know, everything that we talk about. Sorry Day, the removal of all those kids, the removal of us from our land, the removal of our children from each other, the removal of us from our parents, the removal of us from our language, all done with the greatest cruelty that didn't happen in New Zealand, on the basis that you have to dehumanise those people to such an extent that you actually think that's okay, and then you whitewash the history so much that the present living generation actually thinks, well, that's all right. The position of Indigenous people is only one at best of, and I'm talking a lot, I realise, and I apologise.
It's contagious.
But at best is, I think most Australians would think Indigenous people at best are one of a number of ethnic groups that need to be kept happy by Anglo-Saxon Australia in what we pretend is an equal society of cultures. And that completely disregards the fact our vision of how we are. Whereas we see ourselves as one of two equal parties in an ongoing colonial relationship. And so we can't talk properly. You know, even when we talk about the Constitution, we're talking about two different things. What non-Aboriginal people's vision of what recognition is and what we think recognition is, two different things. So I think incredible cruelty that we're all dealing with in mutual ways. I think we as Indigenous people have suffered and non-Indigenous people have suffered because of that proclamation and the things that flew from it. So that's me and that. I won't talk any more for the rest of
Thank you, Michael. I think it's really appropriate that we move next to our poet on the panel. Samuel Wagan Watson is a Murray writer with roots from black soil country in Queensland's scenic rim, coming from a long lineage of political and social activists, with credits including the creation of haiku for Japanese cosmonauts. His approach to creative use of language sees him positioned as one of Australia's most significant contemporary authors. His last collection of poetry, Love Poems and Death Threats, was awarded the 2016 Scanlon Literary Prize, and his works have been placed on the Prime Minister's reading list. Samuel lives and works in Brisbane, dividing his time between working on commissions and personal projects. Thank you, Sam.
I actually, thank you. I actually had my book removed off that reading list, by the way,
Right.
because it was at a time when I felt that he's not going to get it.
Thank you.
So where we start from today, it's wonderful to be here in Gadigal country, Eora Nations. I don't know as much as I should about the early days of New South Wales settlement. Being a Brisbane boy, a Wunjabara man, Munjali. I do know, though, that we come down here and we kick New South Wales butt once a year. Let's be serious. Come from a writer's perspective, the 18th and 19th centuries, it was an interesting time, Darwinism. We had literary greats like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein. The whole emphasis of these volumes of work was that human nature, we love to destroy ourselves to create something pure. And there's now a lot of evidence to show that Sir Joseph Banks, I won't say sir, I mean, this guy was hanging out with Cook and he was carrying vats of smallpox infested scabs. So he was basically testing a new kind of warfare. And most of Cook's journeys were going to where very isolated people were. We had no fight against something like smallpox. Moving then to, and I will touch on the proclamation, but Lachlan Macquarie, governor before Bourke, he actually stated that he just had a gutful of the Eora peoples just not towing the line. So he said, shoot them and hang them from every crossroad. And the ones that you can subdue, treat them like prisoners of war. Now, I'm not a barrister. I'm not a silk. It's pretty much... It was a military occupation. And it being so, that little has been done to reckon. I mean, only 150 years before the last witch burnings in Eastern Europe, 900 people burned, and they didn't find any basis for alchemy. You had people like Sir Isaac Newton getting famous by having apples dropped on his head. He loved dabbling in alchemy in secret. Science was becoming the new god. It was replacing the church. But as far as that went, we were living in a time when they were looking at final solutions, and sadly our mob fell under the hammer of that. And I remember a quote from Auntie Kath Walker, Uluru Noonuckle, my late aunt, Quandamooka Stradbroke. She's saying she was in her late teens before she realised there were other books than Bibles. The mob on Quandamooka and the Moreton Bay region, they only thought English literature existed in Bibles. So whether or not you're an Indigenous person at the time that had a harness of the English language and you understood the bureaucracy of a proclamation such as 1835, it probably wouldn't have done you any good because you had nothing to compare it against. And look, back in the day, if you're a governor of Sydney and you want to check something out with your predecessors in England, it'd take a year to get the message to England, maybe a year for it to be decided, and then a year for it to come back. I mean, that's like one term of Queensland politics, sadly. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. So the next panel member is Professor Bruce Pascoe. Bruce is a Tasmanian and also a Yuin man, an Aboriginal writer with many publications. He's the winner of the New South Wales Premier's Book of the Year, Dark Emu, which is just a fantastic new way of understanding old ways of our agriculture and architectural practices. Groundbreaking work for this country. He also has the Prime Minister's Literature Award for Young Adult Fiction, the Australian Literature Award in 1999, Radio National Short Story Award. There's quite a long list here. He served as a board member of First Languages Australia and lives in East Gippsland. His latest novels include Seahorse and Mrs. Whitlam. Today he was also appointed as Elder in Residence at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. So, Bruce, your reflections.
When Europeans arrived in Australia, they had refined colonialism to its finest point. Every institution that was created in this country after that arrival had drilled into the employees of that institution ways of subduing the Indigenous race. And it wasn't just the military, and it wasn't just the education system, but the church was crucially involved. It was an arm of empire, and its aim was to strip Aboriginal people of the land and give them back the Bible in return. And it might sound like an egalitarian act, but it was far from that. It was simply because of land lust that all of those institutions worked the way they did. They were designed to subjugate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people simply because the land was there, so-called, for the taking. And one day in my brother's country up in Brisbane, I had nothing to do, bros. What's going on up there? And I saw above the bed in the hotel room this painting, And I'd seen it thousands of times before, and it always turned up in churches and in, sacred places and in sacred homes. And it said there was always a legend around it. There were varieties of this painting that could be found all around Australia, and it said something like, and the lamb shall lay down with the lion, and the leopard with the kid, and all sorts of variations of this. And the savage land shall be tamed, and the wilderness shall be tamed by a little child who will lead them out of the wilderness. And, I wasn't a particularly dutiful Christian, and so I just ignored it. And I ignored it, and I ignored it, and I ignored it. I just thought this is just one more arm of an institution which is there to crush us. And then one day, bored in Brisbane, I read the fine print. And when I stood up on the bed, which my auntie had always told me not to do, what I saw in the corner were 3 First Nation Americans with full headdresses on, and in front of them was one of the Pilgrim Fathers with a tricorn hat and his arms out like this, in the Christian attitude of forgiveness and love. And what was in fact happening was that European was negotiating for the land. Now, we know that negotiation was pretty fraught, because what William Penn did was he said to the First Nation Americans, I want so much land. And so the First Nation people, already shot up and humiliated, agreed to this really terrible deal, that William Penn would walk from dawn to dark in a square, and that would represent the land that he would take from First Nation Indians. That's what these little figures in the corner of this painting are all about. But what happened was they trained up runners to run from dawn to dark, in effect quintupling the area. An act of bastardry. And so First Nation American people who thought they were negotiating a deal under incredible duress with a people of honour knew immediately that these people were cheats and liars, and that would be perpetuated through every generation ever since. And that's what the colony was like in America. When it came out to Australia, it was even more brutal. There was never any pretense of sharing the land. It was just taken. And people talk about the convict nation, that it was just for the overflow of convicts from England. It was a humanitarian act to get them off the hulks. What a lot of rubbish. People came out with knotted strings, and as well as the smallpox virus. The knotted strings were to measure land. There's nothing subtle about it. It was to measure land. This was to be taken from the people. And so the proclamation was just one more act to subjugate Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. And we're fighting against it today. And there are so many heroes that worked on the 1967 referendum. I was working with one of the Bandler people today, old Auntie Faith, what an absolute champion. And those people were fighting to claw back some of our culture, some of our land, some of our pride, and we're still doing it today. And we can't relax just because, a Prime Minister said sorry, or just because, all the states of Australia voted in favour of the 1967 referendum. Absolutely fantastic, but hardly a gain for our people just to be counted in the census. Wacko. The council does that for dogs.
Just before we move on to Gail, because it is, do have the Sydney Writers' Festival on at the moment, can I just commend to you the books of these two men? Please go and have a read. They're just absolutely fantastic.
Please, because please. We have children.
Grandchildren.
So I'll introduce Gail Mabo to you. Gail is a celebrated visual and performing artist. She will also be well known to you as the daughter of Eddie Quiggin Mabo, and it's wonderful to have her here tonight. She began painting in 2004. She had a number of successful solo exhibitions in Queensland, and also is a recognised successful dancer and choreographer. Thank you, Gail. Do you have reflections on the proclamation or anything that people have talked about?
Well, for me, one of the things is that when I was growing up, Dad didn't like us in the education system, so he took us out and made his own school. And so the basis of the school was to actually learn black history. It wasn't to learn the books that everyone else had, you know, encyclopedias about James Cook. Who's he? He's a man who wears a funny wig. And then after Dad did what he did, I sort of sat one day and I thought, well, hang on a minute. If they had to do treaties with all the nations before they got to Australia, did he run out of steam? Did he run out of want to do it? Did he just get here and go, what the hell, let's just take it and just get rid of them because I'm sick of talking? So did he break his own law? Because he was actually given the law by the Queen to make treaties with people, to actually, you know, salvage land for the under the British law, but he never did with Australia. So does that mean, you know, he broke something before he got here? So we're actually living under a lie that we are not governed by the Queen, because if you break a law, isn't that punishable? So he should have just got back on his ship and went home. Because that's what it comes down to, is that thing of like, we need to understand why. He's not here to talk about it, but it's like, that would be one that would be out there is going, why didn't you? Was there attempts to do it? And if there were attempts, was it written down? Probably not. The giving of flour. You know, black girls can make their own flour. They grind it really well. And they use better stuff. But it was that thing of like extending those, you know, blankets that were riddled with disease. So it was easier to knock them off than actually talk them. But one of the things is, as a result of that time, my mother is a traditional owner of Palm Island through her grandmother's side. And the things that are exposed now on that island, it's only a small island, but the horrific acts of torture that happened to those people, they are pits where people were massacred, from old people to babies. And my grandfather, he has to go and do ceremony for all of those people who were massacred. It takes them weeks because the bones had just been scattered through this pit. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle, because you've got to find all the baby bones that go with the babies and all and every age. And then he has to wrap them, smoke them, and then rebury them. And that's a hard task. But if we would have made a treaty If we would have made opened that conversation when they first got here, would it be so? Would we all be living harmoniously? Would it be completely different? Or the Dutch have come in and taken over? Never know. But for me, it was one of those things of, what if? You know, then I wouldn't have lost my dad for 15 years. To fight something that, you know, really it wasn't actually written down that he broke his own law. And that's my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. I think time will defeat us for doing another, thinking about another question, but certainly for me it's been really wonderful to hear the four panellists talk about, you know, what is undoubtedly a really brutal history. And I guess the thing that, you know, that really resonates for me is the fact that we are still here. We are still doing, Gail has talked about cultural business that's still going on, but we're still making our way to, in the political system, in the economic system, in social systems. We are still strong despite a very brutal history and a very brutal presence. We were talking earlier about for example, the Northern Territory emergency response, otherwise known as the intervention. That has just really re-brutalised, re-traumatised, a response apparently to trauma that has completely re-traumatised people across the Northern Territory and other mechanisms, legal and policy mechanisms throughout the country. And yet we sit here tonight, artists, professors, writers, telling the stories of the past, telling the stories of today, dancers, choreographers, daughters of groundbreaking activists, sons of groundbreaking activists. And despite the brutality, despite the fact that it is still disordered. You know, the proclamation showed there was disorder. The story of Cook not honouring the instructions he was given shows there was disorder. The fact that we have, you know, a legal and policy environment today where one party will head in one direction and then we have this complete shift and wonder why the situation isn't getting better. And meanwhile, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people saying, we know the solutions. And we sit in this contested political and economic environment. But we're still here and we're still strong, and these stories are really important, and the fact, again, that cultural institutions tell these stories and make these opportunities available is really important. We don't have much time, but is there anything that you wanted to say in closing?
Do you have a story from your wealth of being in the legal background?
Is that a dangerous question?
Brother here was something they've got an intake of 140 young fellows this year.
New students at UTS.
So how many of them are studying law? And what do you think of that?
I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think it's really, I think it's fantastic. I graduated in 1999 as with a law degree, and then I practiced. I've practiced in law. I've worked at the Human Rights Commission. I've tried to put those legal qualifications at the service of social change. And I have to say that recently I'm a Leonard Cohen fan. Make what you will of that. But we're talking the other night about, first we'll take Manhattan, then we'll take Berlin, that great song, because what was ringing in my ears was the opening lines of that are that they sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. And I have to say, I feel a little bit cynical about it right now. A little bit cynical about, I think it's important, it's really important. And it's one path. I guess it's a path I've been down, and now I'm kind of starting to look at a bit of a different path of saying, we try to work within this system and drive change. And I feel that the constitutional conversation has been a difficult one, trying to drive change through this whole kind of legal and political system. And it's important, I think, to really think about other ways of change, the ways of change of us simply being who we are, and strengthening that. So I feel like I've kind of been out there in the big picture a bit, and now it's a little bit time to look back at strengthening who we are. But I think it's fantastic that more lawyers, more people to take that challenge up, because everything changes. I look old enough to think back, and for example, when Nelson Mandela was in prison and everybody thought apartheid had never shift. And people just keep chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. And it might be, 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within, but chipping away like that has an impact. You wear that stone down. The water dripping wears the stone down, and the chipping away changes things, and the talking changes things, and education changes things, there are many. There are many changes within the legal profession. I'm working now on the Royal Commission, just coming late to help out a bit on the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory. And Tony McAvoy's first Aboriginal Senior Counsel will on Monday begin examining and cross-examining witnesses as it moves into the hearings in relation to the child protection system in the Northern Territory, and that's fantastic. I think about Professor Larissa Berend at Jumbunna at UTS, Sam's sister Nicole, who is an accomplished lawyer, accomplished academic, another book to buy, great crime novelist. Nicole Watson, fabulous crime novelist. And there are amazing, and my colleague here, Nathan Tyson, who we studied together at the uni in New South Wales, and people, law is I remember years ago listening to Marcia Langton, who said white education is a ticket to ride. Law degree is a good ticket to ride. You can do a lot of things, and it teaches you really good stuff. And the fact that there are many Aboriginal students coming through with that kind of discipline, that kind of way of thinking, and that we bring our own way of thinking and we learn that way of thinking, and to drive change, I think is really exciting. And I probably should stop now and say thank you for asking me to. Thank you. Thanks. Questions? Oh, yes.
Got time for 2 questions.
Today we had, just recently, we had the Uluru Statement. Have you all read it?
No, I don't think it was out before we actually came here.
If anyone's read it, I just want to know what they said about it.
I think we were all here actually before they did the media.
It's too long.
They hadn't done the media before we all arrived here.
It's basically that apparently Indigenous leaders from across the country outright rejected the idea of mere recognition in the Constitution, instead calling for a representative body to be enshrined in the nation's founding document and a process established towards working towards treaties. I suppose I just asked the panel what they think is going to happen to that.
Who would like to? Anyone want to?
I think it's another round table.
Too difficult, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. I mean, it's a timely question. Did you want to have Michael's?
I'll have a go. Look, remember I said we've been talking about two different things. I think what happened almost from the moment that people started talking about constitutional recognition, Aboriginal people, I had a sense Aboriginal people weren't excited about constitutional recognition. Like, what, they're going to recognise us in the Constitution? Who reads the Constitution? Do I need recognition? And what's it going to do? Is it going to put houses, going to put roofs over people's heads? It's going to stop us being locked up in jail at a greater rate than anyone else in the world? You know, is it going to, what's it going to do? Sure, recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution, but it wasn't exciting Aboriginal people. And what we noticed is Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, I'm sure, were starting to talk about, okay, but this is a good question. What do we want? When do we want it? Now. And what we started to talk about was what we were talking about 20, 30 or more years ago. A proper relationship. Uncle Russell Taylor talks about parity of esteem. That's what we want. We want to be equals. We want our position in our own land. We don't want invitations. We don't want a paragraph. We want dignity. We want decision-making powers over our own lives in the ongoing colonial relationship that we are in. We want to make our own decisions at a community, at a local level, with the answers that we know are needed. And we want the resources to do that. And we want access to our resources. You know, and access to our resources, which we don't have. You know, going back to that proclamation, you know, our people live in poverty, but our lands are amongst the most rich in the world. And what happened is white Australia did this tricky thing with law and pieces of paper that simply said, oh, all the minerals, all the resources, all the forests, everything belongs to the Crown. Just belongs to the Crown. And so we became not only trespassers on our own land, poverty was introduced and the inevitability of intergenerational poverty. While trucks dig up our land and ship it overseas to create the wealthiest white country on earth, we live on the fringe in absolute poverty and die young, while the trucks drive past our communities. And then we get something called unemployment benefits, and then white Australia dislikes us for being on unemployment benefits, while their trucks take our minerals and our resources out of our land. So you've created this poverty, and then you hate us and despise us for living on our own land and taking a fraction of that back in an undignified thing called the dole. So I think the treaty has the capacity to bring back some of the resources and some of the dignity and some of the decision-making power. So I think it's a great thing. That's my short answer.
But all of this depends on goodwill from the rest of Australia. It's not going to work unless Australians get behind it. No law ever does. No educational curriculum ever works without a good teacher. And Australians have to get behind it. I've been working with South Coast communities on bringing back the Indigenous foods, the great domesticates of Aboriginal Australia, Torres Strait Island Australia. And within 2 or 3 years, people are going to be eating these foods out of the supermarket. We've got restaurants and bakers hammering on our door, or certainly hammering on our email door, and they want this food, and they want it now, Michael. And we can't supply it yet. We're working as hard as we can, but we know that non-Indigenous Australia will want to get involved in that industry too. Here is the big test for Australia. Here is the big test of goodwill. Will there be a place for Aboriginal Australia in that new agriculture? This will be a new agriculture because they're all perennial plants. They sequester carbon. They only need Australian rainfall. They only need Australian fertility. In a drying continent, these are going to be wonder foods. So far, not one of our 500 cooking shows has ever talked about them, But as soon as they become part of the public conversation, and that's happening now, I wonder whether Aboriginal people will have a foot in the door. I've got a nephew who was in jail for poaching abalone. Now, no one wanted abalone in this country. It was called muttonfish until the Japanese and Chinese decided to import it from Australia. Millionaires were made overnight. I come from Malakuta. Several of those millionaires are still there. It's a beautiful shellfish, but it is not worth $18 million a year. Our people used it as their traditional food, had ceremony for it, had art for it, had song, and within minutes of that millionaires' trade beginning with Japan, the only people who did not get an abalone licence were Aboriginal. And we are on the precipice again where these wonderful grains, kangaroo grass, panicum, kumbungi, Microcereus lanceolata, all of these wonderful things that will be eating as staples, like we eat carrots and potatoes now, all of these wonderful things, are they going to be stripped from Aboriginal people again, like a new intervention? I hope not, and I depend on the goodwill of Australians.
Thanks, Bruce. Can I bring you back to that? I think it's a really good question you pose, and I just want to, in many ways, those are expression of the same thing that Michael talked about: proper partnership, economic partnership, agricultural partnership, political partnership, social partnership, political partnership, cultural partnership. It's about a proper and meaningful partnership. If those things, if the things that people have talked about in Wiradjuri are part of dripping down and wearing away and creating that proper partnership, that will be absolutely fantastic. But I think there's not an Aboriginal person who would disagree with the fact that what we're looking for is proper partnerships, really real meaningful partnership, respectful partnership. And I think we have come to the end, actually, of our time now.
I just wanted to thank Gail Mabo, Bruce Pascoe, Sam Wagan Watson, Michael McDaniel and Robynne Quiggin. Thank you very much. A wonderfully moving and powerful event tonight, and I thank you all for sharing in it. And I think building a better understanding of our past hopefully helps us take those next steps into the future. So thank you very much for making the time. I'm well aware we need to get Gail to the airport. She began her day at 5 a.m. flying to Melbourne. She's been backwards and forwards between Melbourne and Sydney today. So I've been getting the wind up. Thank you very much, Marcus Hughes and the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. Thank you very much to the fantastic team at Sydney Living Museums. You know who you are, and our wonderful performers tonight, Steve Jins and Jeremy. Thank you for joining us. Please keep your eye out for more Aboriginal Sydney Speaks programming at Sydney Living Museums. Thank you.